Hi, this is Miss Cortez, and I am your biology teacher, and I'm here to talk to you about genetics and heredity. Okay, so you may be asking yourself, what is genetics? And genetics is simply the science of heredity. So you're like, ugh, what is heredity? Heredity is the study of the way traits are passed on from parents to offsprings. So traits are just specific characteristics. So they may be like hair color, eye color, skin color. It may even get down to things like height and nose shape. So there's a lot to be said with genetics. So, how do we inherit our traits? So, our inheritance of traits. So, during fertilization, each parent contributes genetic information, our traits per se, on chromosomes held in their gametes. As if you remember back to meiosis, this is our egg and our sperm that we're talking about. So, the gametes combine to make a zygote, and a zygote is simply a fertilized egg or our first cell as a human being. So, for example, when we have our fertilization, our humans overall, we have 46 chromosomes. You receive 23 chromosomes from your mom, 23 chromosomes from your dad. You have your genetic diversity that makes you up. So let's review our chromosome real quick. So our chromosome simply carries genetic information. It's made up of very compressed DNA and protein. So our genes are just segments on our chromosome. So it's a unit of heredity. So it's a section of the DNA sequence on our chromosome that encodes for a single protein. So usually our genes signal for something more general. So you'll have a gene for making your eyes. You'll have a gene to make insulin. You'll have a gene for temperature regulation. You'll have a gene for producing nails, for producing fur, for making melanin. So these are all your different like genes. You'll have way more than that. Those are just a few examples. So with genes, however, we can have variety within our gene, and that's known as an allele. So an allele is two or more forms of a gene that code for the same trait. For example, this could be brown eyes versus blue eyes. And we even have more alleles for eye colors such as green eyes or gray eyes as well. So with our genetic traits, some of our traits will be dominant and some of our traits will be recessive. So what exactly does that mean? So with our dominant allele or traits, this is with the presence of a dominant allele, the trait is expressed over another trait. So for example, this would be brown eyes. So if you have a brown-eyed and a blue-eyed person get together, it's more likely that the children will have brown eyes because if they contain one allele of both, the brown is expressed over the blue. Okay? With our recessive alleles and traits, this is with the presence of no dominant allele. The recessive allele is expressed, allowing for the recessive trait to be shown. So this is represented usually by a lowercase letter. And for example, it could be lowercase b for blue eyes. So usually our recessive alleles or traits will require two of the same allele to be seen. So this gets us into homozygous versus heterozygous. So a homozygous individual is purebred and it has identical alleles, one from each parent, for a particular characteristic or gene. So if you were homozygous with brown eyes, it means you receive an allele for brown eyes from both of your parents. So you have big B for brown eyes. Or you receive a recessive allele, little b for blue eyes. Okay? The one that's interesting is the heterozygous or hybrid. So these still have they have two alleles. However, the alleles are different for a particular characteristic of gene. So for example, with heterozygous individuals, they would contain a big B for brown eyes, a little b for blue eyes, but because the big B for brown eyes is dominant, they would have brown eyes instead of blue eyes. They would not have a mixture of brown and blue eyes. So our genotype versus our phenotype. So our genotype is known as the genetic makeup of an organism. So this is what we were talking about before with our big B, big B, big B, little b, little b, little b. So our genotype, you cannot look at an individual and figure out their genotype. This is something that we have to look up genetically. So our genotype is the expression of our genes themselves. Our phenotype is our physical appearance. of an organism. So with this, it's brown eyes or blue eyes, okay? It isn't homozygous, heterozygous. It is brown eyes or blue eyes. This can be caused by both your genotype and your environment. So your genotype could be for having brown eyes or it could be for having blue eyes. However, it can also be controlled by environment, not your eye color. But for example, if we look at our little Arctic fox over here, in the winter, it has a white coat, but as we move into the summer, it loses its white coat and it becomes a brownish color instead with a less dense coat. And this is how our environment can also affect our phenotype. So, example, animals whose coat colors changes with the seasons. So who's the father of genetics? So we'll talk about this guy real quick. His name is Gregor Mendel. So today's knowledge about genetics is a result of genetic studies started by Gregor Mendel in the middle 1800s. Mendel did not know about genes per se, but thought that certain factors were responsible for traits passed from parents to offsprings. Mendel concluded that there were traits that always appeared were expressed when they were present in an organism. So, for example, this guy was like a Catholic priest, and he just like it was back in the day where you either became a priest or a laborer or you got married, and like he just didn't want to be responsible for other people, so he became a priest so he could still like go forward with his academic studies. And basically, he was super into teaching science and into breeding pea plants. And he noticed with his pea plants when he was breeding them that if he bred two tall plants together, it would result in a tall plant. And if he bred two short plants together, it would result in a short plant, which, like, hearing that said, it's like, oh, that seems to make perfect sense. However, if he bred a tall plant and a short plant, it would still result in a tall plant instead of a short plant. But he did it so many times over and over that he saw sometimes when he bred a tall and a short together, sometimes it resulted in a short plant. And he kind of came up with these principles through breeding these pea plants again and again to see which traits were passed on to which ones. So not only did he do plant height, but he also did seed color, seed texture, to kind of find out like how these traits were passed on. So we get several principles of Mendelian genetics from him. So these are his principles. So the principle of dominance. So when two genes determine a trait, the gene that is expressed is the dominant trait, and the gene not expressed is the recessive trait. So this gets back to what we were talking about earlier. The principle of segregation. When gametes are formed, the pairs of hereditary factors, genes, become separated so that each sex cell, egg, and sperm receives only one kind of gene. Okay? So this is how you get half your traits from your mom, half your traits coming in from your dad. And then the principle of independent assortment. Members of a gene pair separate independently when the gametes form. So this is how you get one allele for this, one allele for that. So from there, we were able to create things called Punnett squares. So our Punnett square is also called a monohybrid cross, where you can take basically someone's genotype and cross it with another's genotype to see what their possible outcome could be. So how you would do this is you'd state a key by using capital letters of the dominant trait to represent the dominant gene and the small letter of the dominant trait to represent the recessive gene. So like you could do like the eyes thing where it's like big B for brown eyes, little b for blue eyes. So you'd write the cross and show the gametes. And then you draw the Punnett square and place the letters for the female alleles on the side of the square and letters for the male alleles on the other side of the square. And then you'd write the possible genotypes. So basically you would drag the gene across. So you would take the mother's big B and put it in this box and this box, and then you'd take the father's big B, put it in this box and this box, and then his little b would go in this box and this box, and then the mother's little b would go in this box and this box. So looking at this cross, we can see, okay, the possible outcomes for their offspring is you could have one that was homozygous dominant, two would be homozygous recessive, not homozygous recessive, sorry. Oh my gosh, heterozygous. And then one would be homozygous recessive. So 1/4, 1/2, and 1/4. So then we could think about the possible like percentages. So 25% would be homozygous dominant, 50% would be heterozygous, and 25% would once again be homozygous recessive. Then you could also write out the possible phenotypes for the physical expression. So these two kids who are heterozygous, even though they have this little b blue eyes trait, we have to remember that it's not going to be expressed because of the dominant trait. So we would have 3/4 of the 3/4 of 75% of our offspring having brown eyes and only 25% having blue eyes. So this is another example. It goes through where it does seed texture, where it does smooth versus wrinkled. So our big S is our smooth, our little s is our wrinkled. So it goes through and it shows the cross between two heterozygous. And then here you guys can try your own for roses. So red is dominant over white. So that would mean that our big R is red, our little r is white, and then you could go ahead and do your cross. So we can also talk about diseases too. So this kind of gets into where we were talking about like genetic disorders a little bit earlier, where we were talking about some of like our chromosomal disorders and how they appear. Because you're getting half of your information from your mom and half from your dad. How do they show up in you? So, for example, like say a recessive trait. Let me think of a recessive trait. So, for example, a recessive trait could be like I'm trying to think of something. Hemophilia. Hemophilia could be a recessive trait. Okay, so you have your father and your mother get together. Okay, and you have one come out normal. You have two come out as carriers, and then you have one that's recessive, that is homozygous recessive, and they are actually affected. And then if it has dominant inheritance, I'm trying to think of my disease that has dominant inheritance right now. I think it's Huntington's disease that has dominant inheritance. Do not quote me on that. Do not quote me. Give me 1 second. I have it now. Okay. Better recessive inheritance would be like sickle cell disease. So that's passed on recessively. But for our dominant inheritance, that I am correct. It would be Huntington's disease. So, for example, on this one, all you would need is a capital D to have it. So then you can see with Huntington's disease, 50% of the kids are likely to have it. So you just have to have one parent who has it versus here. Yeah. But we'll talk about this more. Have a wonderful evening.